to share in this three-part series will help you build upon the networks you're already building. So next slide, please. So one of the key things that I really want to have everybody focus on is that what we are advocating to do is base everything on facts. Early in the process, when oil and gas came to Pennsylvania, there weren't a lot of facts available to us. They came in, they had a story to tell, they made promises about jobs and money, and although those things are important, we didn't really know if there were risks. We now know, based on the fact that the Pennsylvania Attorney General has released findings from several years of criminal investigations, that in fact, there have been some damages to local communities, particularly to waters of the Commonwealth. And so with that in mind, we want to make sure that we're gathering facts, whether it's from sources like the Attorney General's report, local ways that we can gather information, state file reviews. We're going to talk about all that, but we want to make sure this is the key thing. Local government officials in many instances have an opinion about oil and gas. Some of them might even be leaseholders. We want to ask them to park their opinions outside of the decision-making room and instead focus on the facts that we're going to work to present to them so they can make an informed decision. Next slide. As you heard, I am the Pennsylvania Coordinator of Community Outreach for the Environmental Integrity Project. Most of my colleagues at EIP are attorneys. I am not, but what we do is we try to take the very complicated permitting process and public participation process and really bring it down from the legal standpoint into easily understood language that can engage local community members and their elected officials. Next slide. And as I said, facts are really fundamental to what we're talking about tonight. When you have the facts, you can level the playing field. It's no longer industry's story asking them to trust you on just their word alone. We're gathering the facts to fact check them and the information that they're bringing into your community. And most importantly, as we're building our bridges to local community leaders, we want to make sure we're helping them make informed decisions. Next slide. And there are procedures by which you can actually gain access to the correspondence that's being exchanged between the applicant for a proposed project or the operator of something that's currently built and operating in your community and those elected officials. It gives a peek behind the curtain as to what's really happening, and it helps you to be better informed and to provide more factual questions and really hold everyone accountable. The next thing that you'll hear me talk a lot about is the Act 14 municipal notification letters. These are very important. This is the tip of the spear when a new project is being proposed for your area. That by law, the operators who are seeking a state permit, for example, would have to notify the host municipality, the host county, and the adjoining municipalities that they were seeking a permit to construct an industrial facility, an oil and gas operation, for example. They give that host municipality and host county 30 days heads up that they get a notice before anyone else. They get a really important comment period in which to say, for example, is that a proper use of the land? Really key to local government is they determine where things can be placed based on zoning districts, which Robin will explain, and the state says how something operates. But together, these notifications let you know when the state is considering a new application for a facility in your area. And lastly, local government. We not only want to build a bridge to local government, but we want to fully understand what is their role. And one of the key tools that they rely on is something called the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code, or MPC for short. It outlines things like how they're to divide their land into different districts, how they're to develop ordinances, how they're to hold public meetings and hearings, and how they have to make decisions in a timely manner. If you know that information, again, you will be a better informed participant in the process that does allow for citizen participation. Next slide. So local government, I think, has always been a very fundamental key to getting the protections that a community needs. But I think even more so, now that we have the information that the Attorney General has found that there has been damage caused by some oil and gas operations in some communities. So land development has always been sacrosanct or primary to the roles and responsibility of local government. And among those responsibilities is not only to say where things can be placed, but they have to work in a manner that assures that they're protecting public health, safety, and welfare. So that's a key phrase that if you're newly starting out on this journey, I want to highlight. Every decision that local government makes, and if you go in to speak to local government, try to tie it back to not only facts in general, but specifically ask them for the assurance that they have all the information they need to ensure that their decision will still protect public health, safety, and welfare. Next. So local government is set up a little bit differently in each community based on your population. So the blue box, if you get a chance, you can click on that, and it tells you the difference between townships, boroughs, municipalities, and cities. But suffice it to say that most local governments are constructed this way. There are the elected officials. Those are the people you probably have most heard of. They are your township supervisors. They could be your board of commissioners, your council people. They are the people that are front and center, and they are the ones who are primarily the decision makers on a day-to-day basis. The Planning Commission, I like to refer to them as the research arm, basically. They are a support mechanism for the decision makers who are elected, and they might look into an application that's been submitted. They would be the first stop on the roadmap to creating new ordinances. But the key thing about a planning commission is they are a recommending body only. So if the Planning Commission doesn't happen to agree with your point of view and they recommend something over to the elected officials, not to worry, you get another bite at that apple because the elected officials will rehear some of the points you may have raised at Planning Commission, and the elected officials, their vote is binding, whereas Planning Commission's is recommending only. And finally, the Zoning Hearing Board is a separate animal altogether. That is, they don't meet on a regular basis, much like planning and elected officials, which meet on a monthly basis, sometimes twice a month. Zoning Hearing Board meets as they are needed. And it's specifically for if someone has a piece of land and it's zoned commercial, and they want to, let's say, change it to light industrial, they would have to go and get special permission from the Zoning Hearing Board. And that is something that operates almost like a court hearing, and it has evidentiary proceedings and attorneys are present, and it's run pretty similar to almost like a mini judicial type of operation. And this too is a legally binding vote. So the two entities that are legally binding in their votes are the elected official, the board, the commissioners, the board of supervisors, the Zoning Hearing Board, and the Planning Commission recommends. Next slide. So as you heard Vanessa say, especially if you're starting out on your journey tonight and you're hearing this for the first time, it might seem like there are a lot of facts being thrown around and a lot of terms. And we've set up our slide shows that there are certain pieces that can be pulled out and be maybe reference documents you want to print out, keep near your computer. This might be one of them. I have a colleague that I work with, and he reminds us all the time that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I always tell the community team members, we want to do things in a concerted, coordinated way, but we want to create, number one, a citizens team to help us with that. This is certainly not something we want to fall to one or two individuals or one or two families, but it's really important to bring members of the community who have like concerns together. You want to do fact finding to start. You want to file right to know requests, which grant you the opportunity to see all those documents that by law you have access to. You want to attend meetings. You want to be the eyes and ears in those meetings and hear who's coming to present, who's asking for permits to be approved, what process is currently underway. The Sunshine Act, will give you the parameters under which local government has open meetings and what are your rights to be heard. The Act 14 notification letters we spoke about, and Robin's going to talk about the ordinance work. Now, collectively, these are some of the main pieces that if you said, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we creating our roadmap in our community to gather the information to become an active fact finder in our community? These would be the key subjects. We're going to talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. Next slide. As I mentioned, the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code, or the MPC, is key, and it is available on the resource page at the end of my slideshow, where you can download in a PDF form easy to read information about how a municipality handles a public hearing, how they do zoning, how to write an ordinance and get it approved. It walks you through exactly what they have. They have this rule book. This is the rule book. You need to know it too. And primarily what I want to focus on is the purpose of the MPC is primarily to use land use development with an intent and a purpose to protect and promote the public health, safety, and welfare and the morals of a community. There's much more to the MPC, of course, but fundamentally it is about protections. So that's why we think this is a really good place for people starting out to kind of dive in and see some of the information that's available in the MPC. Next. So again, you're probably, if you're new to this, saying, wow, this is a lot of information. How am I going to keep it straight? So one of the things that you can do is EIP's website has a tab on it that is under what we do, oil and gas. There's a Pennsylvania Citizens Toolkit. And in there, this is what it looks like on the screen. In there, you will find the definitions of everything I'm talking about. You will find examples of how to write a letter in response to an Act 14 notice letter, a good example of an Act 14 notice letter, a bad example. You will find some fact sheets and templates, how to prepare your testimony for a public hearing, and all the keys you need to understand the public meetings and public hearings that might take place as you're involved in your development of your protections in your local community. One thing I do want to highlight is what I call the golden rules. You want to make sure that when you are speaking publicly, that you do one of three things. You either cite to a fact on a page with a document you can provide, your speech is protected because it's facts. Secondly, you can have an opinion, or you can say, this is the way I understand it, the way I read it. It's your protected speech under your First Amendment right. And thirdly, you can ask anything in the form of a question. Now, the applicant may not answer you, the operator or the public official may not answer you, but you are introducing the concept of a concern into the conversation by asking in the form of a question. All of those are protected speech. All of those are done in a way that you're not slandering or libeling anyone. We want to make sure we keep the focus on facts, and we don't want to allow anyone to misconstrue what we're saying and try to attack us for our concerns. Next slide. So bringing this all together, and I know it's a lot for your first bite of this process, if this is something new to you, but here's how I want you to think of this. So on the left-hand side of the screen is what we as citizens need to do in preparation for the middle part, which would be build a bridge, to the right-hand side of the screen, which is engage with the local officials. So let's go through this briefly. We want to do our homework. We want to start by, number one, looking on your website of your local community. Read the meeting minutes, read the agendas, maybe for the last year. Find out what's been happening or what's about to happen in your community and where they are in the process. So you might be able to be right in lockstep with something that's being considered. You want to become a factual resource. You want to do those right to know requests, gather that information, because it's really important that you are speaking factually and you're being a guide basically for your local leaders. If you're going in with facts and you're helping them to understand the facts that might be missing, they too will become more engaged in the process. The really big takeaway is we want to remove the us against them mentality. What happens is many times oil and gas companies will come into a community and they will try to say, it's us leaseholders against all of you. We want to remove that. We want to pull everybody into the middle and say, look, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, there are rules on the books. There are local rules, state rules, county, and federal, and everyone has to follow those rules, regardless of your opinion, regardless of where you stand. If you're a leaseholder or you have a vested interest, that's fine. That's the opinion part of it, right? But everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own set of facts. We want to bring the facts and we want to say, look, put the opinions aside. Let's concentrate on what the law tells us to do, what your local rules tell us to do, and where the facts lead us. And then, of course, we want to forge working relationships. Over to the right-hand side of the screen, we want to encourage elected officials to do what we're doing. Gather the facts. They're in a unique position, right? They can ask for the industry to give them the facts. And sometimes I have to tell you, they don't even know what they don't know. They don't know what questions to ask. I've been in presentations where the company will bring in all these executives and they'll do this very glitzy presentation. And at the end of it, they'll say, we'll take your questions now. And because these are industrial facilities that these communities sometimes have never seen or heard of, and certainly never had to have any approval process involvement, they're baffled. They don't know where to begin. So we want to come alongside. One of the things that EIP has done in relationship with a number of the citizen teams, some of which you'll hear from later, we've developed a growing list of questions. And we present those to the Planning Commission or the local officials and say, until all these questions are answered, we can't deem this application complete. You need to get more information. So working with the local officials, they are in a unique position where they can force transparency, which is what we want. We also want to share lessons learned. Like we said, that last part of our webinar on October 29th will involve actual citizen team members from 3 different communities that are going to share their lessons learned. They're going to tell you some of the things they learned along the way that will help you get started or expand your work in your community. Again, know your local government's responsibilities, because you can ask them to do certain things and they might be surprised that you know what their role is, and they might respond a little better if you kind of box them in a bit and say, well, this is really what's supposed to happen. We'd like to encourage that here. It might nudge them to do the right thing. And lastly, that PA Municipal Planning Code, the MPC, it's going to be your best friend. I've printed it out. I have a binder. I read it. I reference it a lot. It is something where you're going to find a lot of answers to your questions. Next slide. So this is my email address. As we mentioned, if you have questions that we don't get to during the Q&A, or you have a specific something you'd like to know about how to forge those relationships with local government, this is my email address. I'm happy to communicate with you. And Robin, if you click through one more time, there is a resource slide here that this Citizens Toolkit on our website. There's also a link directly to the PA MPC. And we also put out a zoning report where you can read about 31 communities in Pennsylvania, where they are in their oil and gas ordinance. And some of what we have identified, and Robin's going to talk about next, is some of the must-haves we feel are the most protective things you can be asking your local government leaders to please include when you write new or update your oil and gas ordinance. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I turn it back to Vanessa.
Thanks, Lisa. You did a great job as usual.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Robin Martin, the Allegheny County organizer for Food and Water Watch. Food and Water Watch is a national organization that has been hard at work over the last 15 years, creating a healthy future for all people and generations to come. A world where everyone has food they can trust, clean drinking water, and a livable climate. Robin, we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being with everyone. Can you hear me okay? Alrighty, thanks. I am going to share my screen. Thank you all for your patience last time. We had some technology gremlins that wanted to show the whole shoot and shebang instead of just the presentation. So, alrighty. Alrighty, here we go. All right, as Vanessa kindly said, I'm Robin Martin. I'm the Allegheny County organizer with Food and Water Watch. And here in Pennsylvania, we have a very specific project called the Municipal Ordinance Project. The Municipal Ordinance Project was developed to help Allegheny County residents and municipal governments prepare for unconventional shale gas extraction known as fracking that we are talking about. I know we have a lot of people joining us from multiple counties across Pennsylvania and maybe other states, but I'm just talking about this specific project in this moment, and then we'll expand again to Pennsylvania. This started because in 2016 to 2017, we reviewed over 105 Allegheny County municipal zoning codes, and the results were pretty shocking. More than 20 years after fracking was first appearing in Pennsylvania, over 50 municipalities had no zoning ordinances at all on the books, and others were woefully outdated or non-compliant with current state or recent court. But since 2017, we have now successfully engaged with a lot of Allegheny County communities and their local governments together in order to adopt appropriate, legally enforceable ordinances. That's something that I always want to drive home to everyone. We work with the laws that are on the books, not the ones we wish are on the books. So, and we'll get to that a little bit later as well. And also elected officials and neighboring municipalities have taken notice, sought us out, and initiated efforts to enact responsive protective land use ordinances of their own. And we love working with Environmental Integrity Project and Mom's Clean Air Force. So much team effort. Alrighty, so we started talking about zoning. Really, what is zoning? And this right here on the screen is excerpts from some legal cases. So the Euclid versus Amber Realty is one of the oldest known cases that talks about zoning and similar laws. Basically, what this is saying is that you determine the character of the community, not an outside area, or so we think. So basically, in our everyday term, zoning is the ordinance a municipality is going to use to regulate the use of a land in a location, the intensity of that, and the character of the development. And this is enacted or administered by a local municipality. So this is really judging how do you want the content and the character of your community to reflect. So some zoning purposes before we dive back into what we were talking about before. One of the biggest ones here is promoting public health, safety, and welfare of a coordinated development. And public health and safety and fracking, that's going to be a very interesting combination, is it not? Other things like preventing overcrowding, providing a variety of housing, things like this, and all sorts of regulations, sorts of lands and structures and the size. Lots of things that we don't think about every day. As my colleague said, Doug Shields, he said, zoning might not be the most exciting type of law, but is the most important. But I actually think it's pretty exciting too, given all that you can do and be creative. Alrighty, oil and gas and local land uses, what we're here for. PA courts have said it's up to each municipality to consider its character and its economic and environmental interests. And we have to proactively enact zoning and addressing oil and gas uses. The big thing here is zoning addresses where it's going to go, not how. And a lot of the times oil and gas companies will say that we are trying to violate how they're doing it. And we said, no, we are trying to just tell you where you can do it. Because why is oil and gas zoning so important for our health and safety? Well, here's a little picture. So this is Versailles Borough back in 1920. This is what happens when your neighborhood, when your municipality doesn't have a good zoning ordinance or a comprehensive plan. And as you can see on the screen, industrial and residential uses were just mixed together willy-nilly and aren't what you might call a compatible land use per se. So today we allegedly have a more enlightened approach to this with modern zoning, to prevent incompatible uses and protect property and public health, or do we? Alrighty. So this is actually an area in Colorado, in Texas, while other industrial uses might think that this could be unthinkable. Unconventional drilling for natural gas seems to be the exception in any number of Allegheny counties. Here in Texas, looking that we're having a similar situation and maybe not as protective. And here we have a Colorado subdivision. In Pennsylvania, we have the ability at the local level to determine where unconventional drilling and associated land uses go. And it's the locals who have the inherent right to define the character and the content of their community. So one of our big takeaways here is like uses and like places. And so what we try to do here is our typical zoning ordinance divides municipality into districts. And these districts have to do with such as residential, industrial, commercial, things like that. And these zoning ordinances really want to try and segregate the industrial districts from residential so that we don't look like 1920s for Salesboro, so that we don't look like Colorado, or we don't look like Texas. And to make sure that we protect the public health and safety. Alrighty. In fact, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that determined that oil and gas development is actually an industrial use of the land, and that it should not be placed near residential areas, that it's not appropriate, and that you want to keep like uses in like spaces. This is the simplest, most straightforward option, even after different oil and gas companies try to be more creative. So why does zoning work? It uses because we say it's an appropriate use of police power, because it's designed to benefit the health, safety, and welfare of the general community. Here it's saying under a zoning regime that individuals consent to give up certain property rights, but basically it's not as scary as it sounds. It's saying you're agreeing to live in a residential area, or you're agreeing to have an industrial area so that we can have everything separate and keep people as safe as possible. One thing that I want to touch upon here is we are looking at 3 types of permitting that are issued typically with oil and gas. And I apologize, it looked like some of my slides disappeared. They might be out of order a little bit. Things that we really want to think about when we think about oil and gas especially is what kind of permit is being issued here? Is it being issued by a permitted use? A use by right, which means it's allowed to go in any zoning district where it's determined there aren't any sort of conditions put upon it, there aren't sort of safety measures put upon it. Or is it a conditional use permit where we say the decision by the governing body? This is the conditional use is where you can put as many different options on it, and it has the most public involvement with a public hearing and things like that, like Lisa described earlier. And then special exception approval. This means that this type of permit is approved by a zoning hearing board. And that has its merit as well. But when we start thinking about oil and gas zoning, particularly, we think about conditional use being our optimal, then special exception, then permitted uses. Some things that you really want to look for in your zoning. In a little bit of a checklist. Industrial zone. Is your area zoned for oil and gas strictly in an industrial zone? Is it being close to a residential area? Is it trying to be in a commercial district? Although commercial districts, a little bit, are not always bad. In 2009, the PA Supreme Court ruled that local governments have the exclusive right to decide where fracking is, like we said before. In this short list here, we have also talking about the conditional use in all zoning districts, meaning that it's not just permitted and can go wherever it needs to be without saying you need to have specific things going on, like specific setbacks. So here's the next part here, appropriate setbacks from well site. Right now in Pennsylvania, the PA minimum state setback is 500 feet from a protected structure, from an area. 500 feet is just maybe a few steps when you think about it. Although what we'll maybe briefly touch upon later on is the recent Attorney General indictments and the grand jury report have made suggestions saying that the setbacks now for public health and safety should be around 2,500 feet now, which maybe in some areas might not be possible under current PA state law, but sometimes the laws have to catch up with what matters most to health and safety. And other things such as a seismic survey ordinance. This is something in which you want to make sure things such as thumper trucks or other things like that. I'm sorry, my son is yelling in the background. I apologize. So moving right along here, an injection well ordinance. You might have heard this recently locally if you're in the Pittsburgh area of Plum Borough, where they did not list where they should have an injection well in their area because they thought, well, we don't want this to have this in this area, so we don't have it at all, or it just wasn't updated. And a fracking company came and said, you don't have a space for me, so now I get to pick the space for you. So it's one of those things, these are little things that we don't think about right away, but these are things that we definitely want to hit on the mark in the checklist. And moving right into that, maybe a table default clause for unlisted uses. What does that mean? That means basically that anything that you have listed in your ordinance or that you don't have listed in your ordinance, rather than saying, I don't have it listed in my ordinance, so that doesn't mean it can be in here. It said any miscellaneous item, anything like that, means that it has to go to this specific zoning district under these kind of conditions. And other things that we look for too are public lands that may be leased. Another community recently that happened, they were approached by a local drilling company in which instead we wanted to drill underneath your park, horizontal drilling, will that be okay? And a lot of people said, no, this is not okay here. So they're in the process of enacting an ordinance that said anything that's owned publicly by the land, we don't want to lease underground for development. And then other things too are the conditional use language. What sort of conditions do you want to have up here? Do you want to have certain water quality testing? Do you want to have air monitoring? What kind of soil testing? Things like this. There are myriads of things, but these are just things that you might want to touch upon. And here, just for the sake of time, but I'll use this as a little handout. It's just more about conditional uses versus your special exceptions. Like we said before, conditional use really gives you the most express standards and criteria. It'll give you a public hearing and you can attach reasonable conditions to say what you want to have happen in your community. And like we said before, here are some local branches in local government, what can be determined. So you have your planning commission, your zoning hearing board, and your local elected officials. And who do you want to decide the content of your community? Do you want to just say it's permitted and it can be anywhere? Or do you want a zoning hearing board by special exception to say, we can approve or disapprove this, maybe not as many conditions? Or do you want to have something as a conditional use that has an explicit set of conditions that must be met before the permit is issued? There's a public process. You as a community member have the right and the input, as Lisa said before, by attending meetings and as citizens. So after all this, what can you do? Get involved with your local government, like Lisa described before, filing right to knows, attending your council meetings, having local meetings with your elected officials. Ask all of the questions that you need. And determine that if your town is ready to host oil and gas extraction. As the petrochemical industry builds, there are more and more heavily residential, densely populated areas that are now being approached by oil and gas, even during times of the pandemic. And it's like, is this really an appropriate space for my neighborhood? Is it really an appropriate space for any neighborhood? And organizing, hosting a community meeting, getting together, organizing petitions. We always try to say we don't want to have an us versus them mentality, but if our local elected officials are not listening, We have to make our voices heard, and we have to do that in terms of power and people power, and letting them know what we want for the community, because we elected them. They don't get to decide what is best for us without our input. And if you're not sure to organize, we can help here. Please don't hesitate to contact me or my colleague Doug at Food and Water Watch, or any of these wonderful ladies that we are presenting with today. All right. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin, for your great presentation. I will be our last presenter for the evening. As I said before, my name is Vanessa Lynch. I am the Pennsylvania Field Organizer for Moms Clean Air Force. Moms Clean Air Force is a national community of over 1 million parents united against air and climate pollution to protect our children's health, with around 100,000 members in Pennsylvania. Robin, if you want to switch to the next slide. So, oil and gas air pollution, what is it and what can we do about it? That's the title of my part of the presentation for the evening. So I wanted to start with some basic information about conventional versus unconventional wells and fracking. Pennsylvania is the second largest natural gas producer in the nation and a significant producer of methane pollution. There are two kinds of oil and gas wells. There are conventional, or sort of the traditional version of extraction that has been around for over 65 years and is what had been practiced in Pennsylvania for many, many years. And you can see that in the picture on the left. And conventional wells use low pressure water to extract gas from shallow reservoirs. And that type of well is throughout our area. But more recently, over the last 10 years especially, unconventional wells, or fracking, have become much, much more prevalent. And you can see a picture of how that works on the right-hand side. So unconventional wells drill down very deeply, vertically, and then they turn horizontally. And this process requires a mixture of high volumes of water, sand, and toxic chemicals to be pumped into tight shale formations at extremely high pressure to extract the gas. And what comes back up to the surface is a toxic slurry with the additions of heavy metals, salts, and radiation. Next slide, please. So how many Pennsylvanians are in close proximity to the oil and gas industry? You can see this map here, which is an Earthworks oil and gas threat map. The dots represent people who live within a half-mile of an oil or gas facility, and 1.5 million Pennsylvanians live that close. 300,000 students attend schools and daycares within a half-mile of an oil and gas facility. And what we know is that how close you are to the facility makes a big difference in your exposures. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a picture of a FLIR camera footage. A FLIR camera is an optical gas imaging camera that allows you to see the invisible gas methane through this specialized use. Methane is invisible and odorless, and so you can't see it without the use of this type of camera. And methane can be released throughout the oil and gas process, from well pads to flaring to pipelines and compressor stations. And where methane is released, volatile organic compounds can also be released as the gases commingle together. Methane pollution happens when the oil and gas companies deliberately burn, release, or leak natural gas into the air. So it's problematic. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So why does it matter? 30 years ago, when I was a kid, and yes, I am dating myself here, carbon dioxide was the greenhouse gas we learned about. We talked about coal-fired power plants and car emissions and manufacturing, and all those things are still significant and important even today. But with the significant increase of oil and gas production over the last 10 years, we now have to change what we're talking about when it comes to powerful greenhouse gases. And we have to begin to include methane in those conversations. Methane is a greenhouse gas that contributes to 25% of our current climate change. And it's 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And as I said before, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, are also emitted where methane is emitted. And VOCs can really cause a lot of public health concerns. On the right here, you can see a list of all the different kinds of air pollutants that are released through the process. Volatile organic compounds can affect health, and they include things like benzene, which is a cancer-causing agent. VOCs contribute to ground-level ozone or smog and can cause serious respiratory problems and asthma attacks. Next slide, please. So, how does oil and gas affect public health? There's increasing evidence that the fetus is vulnerable to a range of pollution exposures through its mother. And research done in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Texas have found associations between pregnant women living near oil and gas operations and an increase in adverse birth outcomes like heart defects, preterm birth, low birth weight, high-risk pregnancies, and infant mortality. Other studies have found increases in the risk of asthma as well as cancer. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, children are especially vulnerable to air pollution. Why is that? Well, children have a higher respiratory rate. That means that they're breathing more per minute than you or I are. And when they breathe more in, that means more toxins per pound of their body than adults experience. And children don't clear those toxins from their body as efficiently as adults due to reasons related to growth and development. Children's brains and lungs are still developing, so those toxins can have a more significant impact. In this picture, you can see Olivia playing at Summit Elementary School's playground in Butler County. And while the elementary school is 700 feet from the well pad that you can see pictured, the playground is closer. Next slide, please. Coinciding with well pad activity near her school, Jane Worthington, who's pictured here, reported that her daughter developed asthma-like symptoms, infected eyes, gastrointestinal problems, nosebleeds, rashes, joint swelling, pain, headaches, anxiety, and was subsequently diagnosed with being benzene exposed. She said, "I worry every day that my daughter's health has suffered because of her proximity to the 22 gas wells, approximately a half-mile away from her school." And in the picture on the right, you can see the Fort Cherry School District and its proximity to one of the well pads near it. Next slide. And unfortunately, new findings have shown that the estimates of the oil and gas industry on how much pollution they're emitting are woefully wrong. The Environmental Defense Fund did an analysis that showed that methane emissions are estimated to be at least 16 times higher than what the industry reports to the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania. And volatile organic compound emissions are estimated to be nearly 21 times higher. And unfortunately, conventional wells and unconventional wells are both significant sources of emissions. But what we know is that regulations work. We've seen them work in other places, and we've seen them successfully decrease the emissions. Estimates show that protections could significantly decrease methane emissions and thereby volatile organic compound emissions as well. And technology does exist to accomplish this through something called leak detection and repair, or LDAR. Next slide, please. With so many of Pennsylvania's children and families living, learning, and playing near oil and gas facilities, we need to protect public health now. In this picture, you can see a young girl in Dimock, PA, playing next to a well pad near her home, barefoot and having fun. With the industrial process of oil and gas extraction being permitted in our residential communities, this proximity has become more and more common. Next slide. So we talked a lot tonight about the zoning and ordinance work that you can do at the local level. And I myself started my journey with some wonderful people from my local area who are some of them on this wonderful webinar tonight, who really worked to do all of the zoning and ordinance work in our local communities. So I started out right where you are, and my journey has led me to Mom's Clean Air Force and the work that I'm doing. And your journey can include both that local work, but also work at the state level or at the national level. So at the state level right now in Pennsylvania, the Environmental Quality Board and the Department of Environmental Protection have recommended a strong rule targeting air pollution aimed at protecting Pennsylvanians from existing oil and gas sources. It's targeted at volatile organic compounds and methane, and we're all excited to have our first set of these kinds of regulations come to Pennsylvania. We really want to work with the Department of Environmental Protection and Governor Wolf to encourage them that they can go so much further. The two really important ways that we have been advocating that this rule be strengthened are that the rule include low producing wells, that these wells actually are responsible for half of the methane pollution that is coming from oil and gas in Pennsylvania, and so they have to be a part of this rulemaking. And second, the current rule as is allows that if you have had inspections that have gone well, you can decrease the frequency of inspections. And what we know from research is just because in the past everything was working well doesn't mean something unexpected couldn't happen, and it does. Next slide, please. And I know we're all super aware of what's going on in our communities. It's why we're here. It's why we want to get involved. It's why we want to do this work. But what I really want us to also think about is, Pennsylvania itself has an outsized responsibility here. PA is the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the country. Pennsylvania's reliance on local governments to regulate where oil and gas well pad type emissions of the cars in Pennsylvania combined. So at a time where climate change has become such an extraordinarily important conversation, Pennsylvania has to consider how we're a part of that conversation and where our responsibility lies. Next slide, please. This is a picture of myself and my coworker at an EPA hearing in Texas. We were giving testimony about the national standards for methane, which you may know last month, Administrator Andrew Wheeler for the EPA came to Pittsburgh to announce that the federal government was going to roll back the methane protections that had previously been in place. So these protections that we're working on at the state level are even more important. They have even more significance when we have a federal government who has chosen to roll back regulations at the national level. Additionally, I want to point out that 83% of Pennsylvanians believe climate change is a serious problem. It really isn't as small a number as some people think, and it really is something that a lot of us want to work on. The next slide has a great video that I worked on with some local teens. So if you could go to the next slide, Robin, and play that.
Our kids' rates of